The question of who Cain's wife was has puzzled readers of the Bible for generations. According to Genesis, Adam and Eve were the first humans, and Cain was their firstborn son. After Cain killed his brother Abel and was exiled to the land of Nod, the Bible briefly mentions that he knew his wife, and together they had a son named Enoch. But where did this wife come from? The text offers no name, no origin, and no explanation, leaving a gap that has sparked debate, speculation, and theological reflection. For those who take the biblical timeline literally, it poses a mystery if there were only Adam, Eve, and their children at the time. How could Cain have found a wife unless she was his sister or close relative? This possibility is unsettling to modern sensibilities, but for ancient readers, especially within the context of early human survival, it may have been a logical necessity. Some scholars believe Cain's wife was indeed one of Adam and Eve's unnamed daughters. Genesis 5:4 says that Adam had other sons and daughters, a statement that opens the door to the idea that the early generations of humans intermarried within the family out of sheer necessity. In those earliest days when the human race was just beginning, marrying a sibling may not have been seen as taboo. It was simply the only way to fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply. These interpretations, while uncomfortable by today's standards, reflect the practical reality of a world populated by a single family line. Others propose an alternate theory that perhaps God created other humans outside the Garden of Eden, and that Cain's wife came from a separate lineage. While this is not explicitly stated in the Bible, it reflects an attempt to reconcile the logistical challenges of early human reproduction with a broader view of divine creation. Regardless of the theory one leans toward, what remains consistent is that Cain's wife, though unnamed and unexplored in Scripture, represents a crucial link in the story of humanity's beginnings. Her presence, though barely mentioned, invites us to consider the untold stories that lie in the margins of ancient texts. She is a symbol of the unknown lives that shaped the earliest community's individuals whose names were lost to time, but who played essential roles in human development. In asking where Cain's wife came from, we are not just questioning a biblical detail, we're confronting the larger mysteries of human origin, cultural development, and how faith communities interpret sacred narratives. The silence around her identity challenges us to look deeper, to explore not just what is written, but what is implied, and to understand that even in stories of rejection and exile, there are threads of connection, continuity, and humanity being woven quietly in the background. Cain's life began in the shadow of Eden, in a world still trembling from the first acts of human disobedience. As the firstborn of Adam and Eve, Cain carried a unique weight on his shoulders. He wasn't just the first child born after the fall. He was also the first human being to be born into a world already touched by consequence. From a young age, he worked the soil, learning from Adam how to plant, grow, and harvest. Eve, too, shared her stories of the garden, of the serpent, and the sorrow that followed. Cain's life was a blend of hope and burden. He was raised with love, but always under the lingering pain of a paradise lost. When his younger brother Abel was born, they developed side by side, Cain mastering crops in the land, Abel tending animals with a quiet grace. They were two very different souls, shaped by the same parents, but drawn to different aspects of creation. At first, their relationship seemed complementary, but as time passed, something inside Cain began to shift. That change became clear during the sacred offering to God. Abel brought a lamb flawless, pure, and offered it with a calm heart. Cain, after working the earth with devotion, brought fruits and grains, chosen with care and pride. But while Abel's sacrifice was accepted, Cain's was not. The flames consumed Abel's gift, but Cain's remained untouched. For a man who had poured his strength into every seed and harvest, this felt like rejection not just of his offering, but of himself. His face fell. Bitterness started to grow where hope had once been. God, seeing this, approached Cain not with anger, but with warning. Sin was crouching at his door, and he must rule over it. But the hurt ran deep. Cain couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how hard he worked, it wasn't enough, not for God, not compared to his brother. The love that once existed between them turned sour. distorted by jealousy, pain, and a desperate need for validation. Abel didn't provoke or boast, but his quiet peace only made Cain's inner storm louder. One day, Cain asked Abel to walk with him into the field. Perhaps he was still undecided about what he would do, or maybe the decision had already been made long before. The field was a place of work, of peace, but on that day, it became the setting for history's first murder. Cain struck Abel in a moment of rage, and silence fell over the earth. The blood soaked into the soil Cain once tilled with pride. When God asked Cain, "Where is your brother?" Cain responded with that now famous line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" It was a question soaked in defiance and guilt, and God's reply was both judgment and mercy. Cain was cursed to wander, but not abandoned. He was marked, protected from being killed, even as he carried the weight of what he'd done. In this moment, Cain became not only the first murderer, but also the first human to truly experience the depth of alienation, consequence, and divine grace all at once. His story is not just one of failure, but of complexity, the painful beginning of human moral struggle, played out in the lives of two brothers. After the murder of Abel, Cain didn't just walk away from a crime, he walked into the reality of what he had become. The silence that followed his act wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of irreversible change. The earth, which had once responded to his hands with fruit and growth, now seemed to recoil from him. When God confronted Cain, it wasn't with thunder or fury, but with a quiet question. "Where is your brother?" It was not a question of ignorance, but of invitation, a moment where Cain might have confessed or sought forgiveness. But his reply, "Am I my brother's keeper?" revealed a soul already distancing itself from remorse. It was a sentence that hung in the air with a mix of arrogance and pain, as if Cain himself wasn't sure how to carry what he had done. And yet, God did not strike him down. Instead, he spoke of a new burden, a curse that would follow Cain wherever he went. The ground would no longer yield to him. He would become a wanderer without a home, a man exiled not just from Eden, but from the stability of any life he once knew. What makes this moment so haunting isn't just the punishment, but the unexpected mercy that comes with it. Cain, overwhelmed by the thought of exile, pleads with God not because he wants to escape guilt, but because he fears being killed by others who might seek revenge. He knows the world is bigger than just his family now. He is afraid, vulnerable, undone, and God, hearing this fear, responds not with dismissal, but protection. He places a mark on Cain not as a badge of shame, but as a sign that no one should harm him. Whoever kills Cain, God says, will suffer vengeance 7 times over. This isn't the image of a vengeful, distant God. It's something else more complicated, more intimate. It's a divine act that says, yes, you are guilty. Yes, you will face the consequences, but I will still be with you. It's a kind of grace wrapped inside justice. Cain walks away, not free, but not destroyed. He is marked, watched over, and yet still cast out. A living paradox. It's the first glimpse in Scripture of what it means to be both punished and protected by God. That mark on Cain has become one of the Bible's most mysterious symbols. For Cain, it must have been a constant reminder not just of what he did, but of the fact that God still saw him, still cared enough to intervene. Imagine living every day with the knowledge that you are the reason your brother is gone, that you carry a curse, and yet you are not allowed to die. That kind of existence is heavy, but it also opens the door to reflection. Cain's life from that point on became a journey through desolation, loneliness, and memory. He wandered east of Eden into the land of Nod, bearing within him both the scar of his failure and the strange comfort of divine presence. And in that duality of guilt and grace, Cain becomes more than a villain in a story. He becomes a mirror of humanity, flawed, impulsive, desperate, and yet somehow still within the reach of a God who refuses to let go completely. The story doesn't excuse what Cain did, but it does ask us to look deeper at how justice and mercy can exist side by side, even in the darkest corners of the human heart. Cain's exile didn't end with just wandering. As he moved east of Eden into the land of Nod, He carried more than just the mark on his body, he carried a longing to reclaim some part of himself. Despite the weight of his crime and the curse that followed, Cain didn't disappear into silence. In time, he found a companion, a wife, and they had a son named Enoch. That moment marked more than just the continuation of his lineage. It marked a shift in Cain's story from punishment towards something more complex, a chance at rebuilding. With Enoch's birth, Cain made a decision that was bold and unexpected. He began to build a city. For a man cast out and sentenced to roam, this act felt like resistance against his own fate. A city wasn't just shelter. It was structure, legacy, and the possibility of community. Cain, the farmer turned wanderer, now became the first human to create something that would last beyond his own life. Naming the city after his son wasn't just about family pride. It was hope that something good could grow out of everything he had destroyed. Building that city wasn't easy. It wasn't just about putting up walls or carving roads. It meant convincing others to join him, to trust him, to believe that life could begin again. Cain was no longer just a man with a past. He was now a leader with a vision. The city of Enoch, as it came to be called, wasn't simply a gathering of tents. It became a home, a place where people could plant roots. Cain taught them how to work the land, how to build, how to organize. He poured himself into the labor. Each stone laid perhaps a quiet atonement for what his hands had once done. There's something deeply human in that transformation, turning guilt into action, turning sorrow into creation. The city didn't erase his crime, but it gave him and those who came after a way to live with it. In many ways, Enoch became a sanctuary not just from physical danger, but from isolation. It gave Cain and the early people a sense of purpose, structure, and a shared future. Cain's story is often remembered for the murder, the curse, the mark, but this chapter of his life, the building of Enoch, shows a different layer. It reminds us that people aren't defined solely by their worst moment. Even in exile, Cain dared to dream. Even with blood on his hands, he chose to build. That doesn't erase what he did, but it shows that even deeply flawed people can still create something meaningful. His city became the first sign that humanity, even in its brokenness, seeks to rebuild. Cain's legacy isn't clean or easy, it's complicated, just like all of us, but maybe that's why it matters. In a world still fresh from the fall, he was the first to prove that from ruin, something new could rise. He didn't find redemption in words, but in action, in shaping a place where life could go on. And in naming the city after his son, he didn't just honor the next generation, he dared to believe they could do better than he did. In the earliest days of humanity, the world was a vastly different place, raw, unformed, and deeply personal. With Adam and Eve as the first human beings, all of humanity began from a single family. That meant the earliest generations had very limited choices when it came to relationships and reproduction. Cain, for example, likely married one of his sisters, though the Bible doesn't name her. Genesis 5:4 tells us Adam had other sons and daughters, suggesting a broader family tree than the one usually highlighted. For modern readers, the idea of sibling marriage feels unsettling, even wrong. But in that ancient context, there were no laws, no tribes, no broader society, only survival and the drive to fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply. These early unions were not framed as immoral, but rather as necessary. Without them, the human race wouldn't have expanded. It was a different world with different expectations, and the moral frameworks we hold today simply didn't exist yet in the same form. It's important to understand that in those early generations, the risks we now associate with inbreeding, genetic disorders, biological concerns were either not known or not yet a factor due to the relative purity of the original human gene pool. Over time, as generations passed and the population grew, social norms evolved and laws began to form. The Levitical laws, introduced much later in the Old Testament, specifically prohibited close relative marriages. But those laws came after hundreds of years of human development. They reflected not just a growing population, but a shift in understanding morally, socially, and even practically. What was once a survival necessity became a prohibited act, not because of sudden new morals, but because humanity had moved into a new stage of civilization. The early marriages between siblings or close kin were never glorified or celebrated. They were simply the only viable option in a world where the human population could be counted on two hands. These stories don't ask us to agree with ancient customs, but to see the progression of moral and cultural evolution across time. Looking at Cain and his wife through this lens offers us a window into the complexities of early human life. Her presence in the story, unnamed and unexplained, reminds us that the Bible often leaves out details we wish it included. But it also shows us that behind the scenes, there were people living, loving, and building families in a world still being shaped. The fact that Cain had a wife and son, and later built a city, suggests that family life was already beginning to form, and that human connections were evolving into something more structured. Those early relationships, however, they formed laid the groundwork for everything that came after. And while it's easy to judge ancient practices through a modern lens, it's also humbling to realize how much of what we now take for granted, social laws, community structure, ethical boundaries, had to be built from the ground up. The Bible doesn't shy away from these complexities. It asks us to reflect on them honestly. Cain's wife, and the world she belonged to, may remain a mystery, but she represents something universal: the human drive to continue, to connect, and to make meaning out of even the most fragile beginnings. The Bible, at its core, is not just a book of stories. It's a layered collection of truths, mysteries, and traditions passed down through generations. Cain's wife is a perfect example of how a single unnamed figure can open the door to questions that stretch far beyond the page. Her presence, brief but vital, invites us to explore the silence between the lines, to wonder about the people whose stories were never fully told. And in doing so, we're reminded that the Bible was written in a time and culture very different from our own, when what was recorded and what was left unsaid were both deliberate. Through centuries, believers have wrestled with the meanings behind these gaps. What do they imply? Are they simply omissions, or are they invitations to reflect more deeply? This process of searching, questioning, interpreting isn't about weakening faith, but strengthening it. It's about understanding that sacred texts are not just meant to be read, but lived with, wrestled with, and sometimes even struggled through. In this, tradition becomes not a rigid mold, but a living bridge connecting us with those who came before. Submission to divine will has always played a central role in how communities interpret these ancient stories. Whether it's Abraham being asked to sacrifice his son, or Jesus praying in the garden before the crucifixion, obedience to God even when the path is confusing or painful is a recurring theme. Cain's story, in its own way, touches this theme too. His rejection wasn't just about the offering, it was about the heart behind it. God sought not just a gift, but a genuine surrender. And when Cain failed, God still pursued him, warned him, even protected him. That's the kind of relationship the Bible constantly portrays. One where God doesn't just hand down rules, but longs for connection, transformation, and restoration. Traditions help us remember that. Rituals, teachings, and religious practices aren't meant to trap us. They're meant to guide us. They're reminders of a bigger story we're all a part of. And as we read stories like Cain's, we're challenged to think not just about what happened, but about how those moments reflect our own hearts, choices, and the ongoing human desire to be known, accepted, and redeemed. In today's world, where fast answers and instant opinions dominate, it's easy to forget the power of slow, sacred reflection. We often approach ancient texts with modern expectations, demanding they fit into our current frameworks. But stories like the one of Cain's wife remind us that some questions don't have quick answers, and that's okay. What matters is the pursuit. Just like Cain tried to rebuild after everything fell apart, we too try to find meaning in brokenness. Whether you're religious or not, there's something deeply human about that. Maybe the real lesson isn't about who Cain's wife was, but about how we live with the unknown, how we carry our past and still try to build a future. In real life, we all have chapters that feel incomplete, moments that don't make sense, stories we wish had clearer endings. But perhaps Like in the Bible, it's not about having every detail laid out. It's about trusting the process, holding on to what we do know, faith, family, the pursuit of truth, and letting that guide us through the mystery. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are not the ones with all the answers, but the ones that teach us how to keep asking the right questions,